We're all set. But if you have to, you know the drill. If you have to stop for anything, by all means, we'll just pick up where we left off. But all right, are you all set?
I'm ready.
Let's have some fun. I appreciate this. Um, you know what, Amy? I've actually been dying to know this too. Is um, when did you know that you wanted to be a journalist? Did you is this a lifelong passion, or did you fall into it like I
No,
did?
it's a lifelong passion from the time I was in grade school. I've wanted to be a writer. And when I was a little kid, when my family, when we, took trips for vacation, I would come home and I would make a little book and write a little story about our trip and everything. And I've always been a reader. And so as I got into middle school, I just imagined that journalism would be a way to, actually make a living as a writer.
I gotcha. When did you become an environmental reporter, though?
Yeah, so I got into environmental journalism a little later in my career. I spent most of my career in print journalism, and I transitioned over to radio back in 2011 or so. And I started my professional career in Nashville, Tennessee. And I worked at the Associated Press for a few years, and then I freelanced for many years. And in Nashville, I specialized in religion and spirituality, which is, a very big part of life in Nashville. It's the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I
Right.
was fascinated by that and enjoyed that. And then I moved back to Florida. I grew up in Florida and moved back to Florida for family reasons. And when I moved back to Florida in 2006, it was just kind of like, man, what happened here? Because the state had experienced this explosive growth in the early 2000s. And, and I can remember, I grew up in Clearwater and Sarasota. And when I was a kid, my family had a boat, and all of my parents' friends had boats. And that was how I grew up. And so after I moved back to Florida as an adult, I can remember a boating trip and out near Crystal River, and the water was just infested with jellyfish, to the point where you really couldn't swim off the back of the boat. And so I just kind of started pitching more and more environmental stories. And then in 2008, I pitched some stories on the Everglades, and I just became hooked on the
Wow.
Everglades.
I can totally relate to that. Growing up in Florida, growing up in South Florida, and then going off to college, and this career, as you know, takes you a lot of places, and then coming back, and I said, where did all this come from? I mean, it's just roads I grew up on that were 2 lane were now 8 lane, and I'm just like, wow, this is too much. Um, and I was thinking about that because you mentioned those memories. But you know what? Let me come back to something you said. You were in print first, and then you came to radio. And I know a lot of people make that jump. And was that an easy, transition? Did you? I mean, obviously you love it. You're really good at it, by the way. So, but was that an easy transition for you? Do you prefer one more than the other?
I'm not bilingual, and I don't know what that's like, but I imagine, this might be a little like that to a small degree. It's two very different ways of writing. And so, even now, I've been in public radio for 10 years. And even now, when I am planning, when I'm first beginning a story and I'm kind of, writing out my reporting plan, even now I'll do an initial outline as a print story, and then I'll do the reporting, and then after I do the reporting, I'll do another outline as a radio story. Um, and and yeah, so it's two very different styles of writing. um, but I'm so grateful, that this is where I ended up. And journalism is a challenging place to be, and in public radio I have this opportunity to do like really meaningful journalism, that challenges me and energizes me. So it all worked out.
So, what's it like covering a topic that has, I mean, over the years become extremely divisive and political. Does that add to it to make it more fun, or does that make it harder?
I think for me, I have a very analytical mind. And so when I hear, various groups of people, kind of like, well, this is what we say, and this is what we say, I kind of feel like my job as the journalist is to figure out what actually is true. And so I enjoy, going to the scientific reports and reading the reports and understanding the science behind all of that stuff. I enjoy that.
Is it, you know what? I mean, I know depending, it seems like in the world we live in, your audience has chosen you. So our public radio audience has chosen us. They love public radio, and they tend to be people who, at least from my experience, but maybe you could share on this is, yeah, they tend to believe in the science. Okay, I don't know how often you get a listener or someone who's going to write in and say, you know what, I deny all this. I don't care for this, and I'm tired of these stories. I don't know. Does that ever happen?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot about the fake news in recent years, and I'm sure you do the same. I think a lot about those people who believe I'm the fake news, and I think a lot of, I mean, my job, I'm a professional communicator. I mean, my job is to inform and educate, and excuse me, here comes my cat. Um, you
Always
know,
welcome. Always welcome.
Right. And, since 2020, there's kind of a life or death component to that. You're delivering information that people are using to make, really, big decisions for themselves and their families and their health. And yeah, and so I think a lot about those people who think about the fake news and how to reach those people.
I wondered, because obviously over the last 5, 6 years, mentioning that phrase, fake news, not something I'd really ever heard before, not before a specific election, and so I'm lucky in that I'm in a studio more often than not. If I ever get called out by somebody, it's online on social media, but I'm not out in the field like you are and other reporters are. And I don't know, is that something that you run into? Is that something that's caused any concern for you in the way you do your job?
Well, on the environmental beat, I deal with that perhaps to a lesser degree. And, I speak to a lot of scientists who are data driven and, but again, my job is to talk to everyone, um, and, give a diversity of voices of an opportunity at the microphone. Um, and and again, in talking to everyone, usually kind of at the center of what everyone is saying, that is where your kernel of truth is.
Mm. You wrote your first book. It's your first book, right? It came
Hmm.
out last year. And it was the Everglades and Big Sugar. And I wondered if you spoke to any politicians or anybody in the sugar industry after the book came out, if anybody's responded and what that's been like.
Yeah. So yeah, the book is called Moving Water, The Everglades and Big Sugar. And so, obviously during the course of writing that book, I visited the Everglades agricultural area many times and, talked with as many farmers, as I could. And many of them just asked not to be named in the book. And, so I respected their wishes. Um, yeah, George and Mary Barley, are just fascinating figures in Florida environmental history, and I just was fascinated by their story and just wanted to tell their story, and but they're very controversial figures in Florida environmental history, and So, a lot of people just didn't want to be named in a book about them.
Oh, I know that all so well. I mean, so you spend a big portion of your career in print, then you go to radio, and then writing a book. And a lot of journalists do this, and that's a whole nother like a ball of wax. I mean, this is like it's a different approach in telling a story. You have a lot more space and time to string it out and bring in a lot of different characters and raise questions and then find those conclusions. But what's that challenge like? Telling, being a reporter, but telling the story in the form of a book. I mean, that's a lot more work.
It was a lot of work, and it was very stressful.
All right, so I'm not going to do it. Never mind. All right, good. You talked me out
No,
of it.
but it was a great experience. I recommend doing it. But I just, I met Mary Barley in 2008. There was big news in Everglades restoration that year. Former Governor Charlie Crist announced plans where the state would buy out U.S. Sugar Corps and put that land toward Everglades restoration. And so I did a story on the Everglades Foundation, which was, kind of behind that deal, and met Mary Barley that way. And then a few weeks later did a personality profile on Mary for the Christian Science Monitor, and just was fascinated by her and fascinated by her story. And I always knew that was a good story, and I always knew it was a book. And but as you said, a book is a big undertaking, and I had some things going on in my life that made it challenging to dedicate the time to it. My daughter was born and things like that. And so it took me a while to, get an agent and get a contract and, and do the writing and all of that. And then, of course, my deadline for my manuscript was the end of the year 2019, and my deadline for edits was March 2020. And so my book was going through production at the same time. Our newsroom was very stretched by the pandemic news and everything. So
Oh, well, just as the pandemic is hitting, I mean, right? Isn't that around the time? Was it March 2020? That's
yeah, so I took
wow.
I took vacation the first week of March 2020 to finish up my edits. And I can remember working on my book and having my computer on in the background, and DeSantis doing a news conference where he's announcing one case in Florida and then a second case in Florida. And so I got my edits done, and then I went back to work the second week of March, and that was the last week that we were all in the building together.
No, I found some old photos of yeah, there was the end of March into April of 2020, and I had been driving the streets of Miami, and I felt like I was in an apocalyptic movie or something. It was very, very strange feeling. Um, Looking back on that book, um, is that something that again, coming back to the different ways that we tell stories, is that something preferable? Do you enjoy telling, doing reporting that way, knowing it is a lot more work and takes more time, but is that something that you prefer, or are you thinking, all right, I got that done, and I don't, I don't know if I want to do that again?
No, I would love to do another book. I love long form journalism, and that story is a great example of one of those very controversial stories where as the author of a book, you have an opportunity to kind of go in and look at the science and figure out what actually is true, and and put some truth to the kind of he said debate that's taking place in the public. So and um, it's helpful, I think, to think about a book not as one story, but as almost kind of like a series of stories or a series of anecdotes broken down by chapters. Um, but yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a lot of work. It was stressful. I'm taking a break from it now. But Yeah, I would love to do it again.
Well, give us a synopsis. So this is come on, let's go. Promote it right now, right here.
So, Moving Water is the story of George and Mary Barley, and George and Mary Barley are two very well-known, influential Everglades advocates. In the early 90s, George Barley was a wealthy real estate investor in Central Florida, very politically connected, and he loved to fish in Florida Bay. And so, as Florida Bay was experiencing, just very serious environmental degradation, he just became enraged. And as he learned how the problems in Florida Bay were connected with problems farther up the peninsula in the Everglades, he became enraged. And he also believed that it was a result of government corruption. He thought that sugar growers who are part of a very large farming community in kind of the heart of the Everglades in a region called the Everglades Agricultural Area. He thought they were not paying their fair share toward Everglades restoration. And so he was pushing a ballot initiative that would have taxed sugar growers to raise money for restoration. And he died very suddenly and very tragically. He was in a plane crash and he died. And at the time of his death, he was, his political stature was probably close to that of the, Secretary of the Interior. And so after his death, Mary Barley kind of picked up his cause, and in 96, pushed a ballot initiative that at the time was the most expensive political campaign in Florida history. And today she's still very engaged and very influential. You might remember that the Everglades Trust gave a critical endorsement to Governor Ron DeSantis in 2018. The Everglades Trust is another organization that was started by the Barleys. And so Moving Water is their story. It's the first book to tell their story. And it also tells a story of how Everglades restoration got started, kind of in the context of their story. So,
By the way, where did that plane crash take place?
in Orlando,
In Orlando? Okay,
in
yeah.
downtown Orlando.
No, I'm remembering bits and pieces of it, but I recall being in Southwest Florida when Charlie Crist was governor, and they had made that announcement of wanting to buy a lot of the sugar land, for Everglades restoration, and there was fear in some of those little small communities out there that they would disappear. And I grew up in one of those communities, and this is a fact to me. It's a fascinating story because I'm connected to it in more ways than one, and I think that's one of the interesting parts of like covering Florida is in some way we're all connected to these stories. When you get the chance to report, and environmental stories, or at least I'm just seeing this, from my perspective, I envy, you guys, reporters who get to go out there because I don't know, do you get to spend a lot of time out there in the Everglades, in the environment? It just seems like fun, and I wish I could be, out of the studio more often. But do you get to do that? Do you get to be out in the field a lot more?
Yeah, and you should go to the Everglades. You live right there in South
No,
Florida.
I
You can
mean,
go anytime.
no, no, no. To visit, yes. I'm just saying, as a reporter, I envy when reporters get to be in it, and I'm in a studio. So
Yeah, obviously I love being in the Everglades, and the Everglades, it's such a, kind of, a it's, the Everglades, it's kind of a mystery, I think even to a lot of Floridians. I write in the book that it's not really one of these, um, you know, natural, you know, I'm trying to search for what I'm trying to say. It's not one of these, natural features like, the Grand Canyon that's, really, demands, your attention. The Everglades, it's a much more settled place. It's very flat, and, it's not an easy environment. It's hot, and it's difficult to, the terrain is difficult and everything. But it's just, if you have an opportunity to get out there, the water is very cool and refreshing. It's not like, weird mud or anything like that. And it's great to get out there in a kayak or an airboat, or even, just do a muck walk. And, um, you know, of course, in 2020, my daughter is 8 now, and so she was home from school with me for a lot of 2020, and I was finishing up my book, and I also did a podcast on the Everglades that was made available at the end of 2020. And at the time, my daughter was in kindergarten and first grade, and so she could hear me working on all of this stuff. And so at one point, she said to me, she said, "Mommy, I want to see the Everglades." And so I said, "Okay." And so over New Year's, we drove down to Everglades City, which is just a great place. And we did Big Cypress National Preserve, and we took kayaks out. And my mom came too. And we took kayaks out, and we were out there in these kayaks. And my daughter said, "Mommy, I want to feel the muck." And so, and so we helped her get out of the boat, and so she was in the water, up to her waist, and I was so proud of her. So that was really great. Yeah.
No, no, it's the little experience that I've had when I was a reporter before I was a host. It's one of the things that I did enjoy about being out in the field is not going to City Hall, not going to those places, but getting out into environmental stories, even covering. Sadly, to say this, it may sound weird, covering disasters or things like that. I remember when the first disaster I had was a wildfire out in the mountains. I was living in Colorado, and yeah, the mountains are beautiful, but it is a powerful thing when you have to go out there and cover something like that. But being in the environment, I think, has just always been, one of those things. I don't need to tell you. By the way, I'll have to introduce you to a young man I just had the chance to interview. He's a TikTok star, but he's from here in South Florida, and he's a photographer. I I dubbed him the next Clyde Butcher, but he is fantastic. He goes out to the Everglades and he takes some of the most
I
amazing
think I'm
photos.
familiar with him.
His name
Yeah.
is Luca. You
Yeah,
know,
I'm not on TikTok, but my friend
okay,
is, and she
okay,
has sent me some of his.
or
Yeah.
or Instagram, but he is amazing, and some of the stories that he shared with me, and I just thought, wow, Anyway, besides that, finishing up here, I wanted to ask you, moving forward, as an environmental reporter, where do you see this part of the field going? As the world is changing, and maybe not for the better necessarily, but environmental reporting, where is it going from here? Where does it need to go? This next generation coming up, if you were talking to them, what do they need to know?
Climate change. That's what I'm focusing on now. And lately I've been focusing on clean energy and renewable energy. In Florida, water issues in the Everglades, it's such an integral part of being a Floridian. And so, water issues, that'll always be an important story in Florida. But I'm starting to turn my attention more and more to like clean energy and renewable energy and climate change.
What is, I mean, because you're in Central Florida, what are the discussions like about, on that issue? With the public, with your audience, what are they asking of you? What are they demanding right now?
Well, in Central Florida, probably one of the biggest stories of the year for me is going to be just this horrible manatee die off that we've been experiencing in the Indian River Lagoon. And
Mm.
that's a very complicated situation because the Indian River Lagoon is, just suffered, widespread water quality problems and seagrass losses that have led to the manatees' starvation. And the other, kind of theme to a lot of my reporting in Central Florida and, across Florida really is this, just this mind boggling population growth and the strain that is putting on our natural resources. Here in Central Florida, I have been reporting recently on, skyrocketing housing costs. And, of course, that's an issue across Florida. And, the population is just going to continue to grow. I did a story last week on Split Oak, which you may have heard about. And that is a plan to put a toll road through protected land in Central Florida. And a lot of people are worried about that because it's protected land. And so a lot of people feel like, well, if we can put a toll road through protected land, then no place is protected really. Um, and so, that'll just continue to be an issue, that population growth.
For you, I mean, having grown up in Florida, and as you said, you remember from your childhood some really beautiful memories of how much you used to enjoy the nature. Being an environmental reporter and seeing the growth, the damage that's being done, climate change being the problem that it is, how does that shape you personally, your view of the future? You a pessimist, an optimist? Can you stay neutral on this?
No, yeah, I mean, you have to be an optimist or else what's the point of anything, But, the thing that I think about is my daughter. Um, we just had the story last week where State Agriculture Commissioner Nikki Fried announced new renewable energy goals for the state. And these goals are a result of a petition filed by Florida youth associated with an organization called Our Children's Trust. And Our Children's Trust is an organization that specializes in climate change litigation on behalf of young people. And so I just was talking with the attorney about, the experience these kids have, as a part of this litigation, and how, the attorneys talk with them about climate change and climate anxiety and all of those kinds of things. And it's a, yeah, it's a very different time, to be growing up. And I think about that a lot. Yeah.
I am optimistic, I think, but the pessimist in me does not like sitting back, and he is loud and obnoxious. Last question. You've been a journalist for a while now, and the purpose of the podcast is to try to help people understand what we do. And yes, there's a narrative out there. Politicians are always attacking us, but they've pushed a narrative, and there is a lot of distrust. But what is it that you think people get wrong about who we are and what we do? And I wondered if maybe there's something we could do to help them understand it.
Yeah, well, I think the podcast goes a long way. I think, the fake news, what is that? It's like it's a concept, it's a rhetoric, but you and I, we're people, and I don't know about you, but I have people in my life who are like, well, that's the fake news, but not you. You're not the fake news. And I think, things like this podcast, that personify us. And, I mean, just in popular culture, reporters are, usually portrayed in not very accurate ways. And so it's just, it's great to have the opportunity to talk with you about, what I do and giving people a chance to get to know us.
Yeah, maybe they should make more movies. Granted, our day to day life isn't that exciting, so I don't know what action they would capture.
They should just show all the president's men every day on TV.
Yeah, I know. I always think about that too. Amy, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being in the reporter studio.
It's great talking with you. Thanks so much.
All right, let me stop the tape. That was fantastic.
Yeah, that was a
I,
great conversation.
I,
Thanks so much.
no, I appreciate it, and don't worry. I've had two or three people whose pets love to be part of the show. I always appreciate it. I do. All right, it looks like everything is there. Let me make sure. All right, and I'll end the broadcast.